Content warning. This following episode contains short mentions of rape, sexual assault, and harming other humans. Listener discretion is advised. Hello everyone, welcome to a new season of Not a Doctor podcast with your host, Money. I've lined up some very fun and interesting episodes that are going to be published in the next few weeks, and we're going to get even more philosophical and emotional this time around. And what's better than starting off the season with today's episode, the biological basis of ethics. Now we're going to completely ignore trying to debate whether stuff like rape or trans people having rights is ethical or not, because rape is unethical and trans people obviously have rights. If you disagree, you can kindly piss off. What I'm going to try and answer is whether or not there is a scientific or evolutionary reason to why we actually have ethics and morality. Or at least most of us do. Ethics, among a few other topics, is one of the main differentiating factors to why we see ourselves separate from other animals. Some might argue better even. But why? Why is it so important for us to follow these set of rules that are either laws or common courtesy that we, on a larger global basis, actually follow? So we have three kinds of ethics in evolution: descriptive evolutionary ethics, prescriptive evolutionary ethics, and evolutionary meta-ethics. Descriptive evolutionary ethics uses evolutionary theory to explain the origins of human capacities, tendencies, and behaviors, such as our sense of fairness or resentment towards other people. This is the bit that I'll be going to focus on since it's what us science-oriented people like to do. But I will have some arguments against it, don't you worry. Prescriptive evolutionary ethics applies evolutionary theory to justify or challenge certain ethical claims or theories, like humans are above all other creatures on this planet, or capitalism. Finally, evolutionary meta-ethics. This theory is about moral discourse itself, either supporting the semantics of moral judgment, as in they're not moral facts, just moral expressions based on things like emotions, or going against quote-unquote objective moral values. So there's this thing called moral truths in evolutionary meta-ethics, which is essentially trying to figure out if some things are objectively moral, within evolution itself specifically. I'm not talking about how, for example, rape is objectively bad, because again it is, and regardless of the conclusion of this episode, if you are someone who has raped another person, then you deserve to rot in hell. But the very fact that people are facing this threat by other humans every single day on every part of the planet questions if there ever was an evolutionary advantage pushing towards us as a species to not want to harm other humans, whether it is through killing someone or rape. It is crucial that I highlight the fact that any human who harms another human through any means is not behind people with morality in terms of evolution. Moral people aren't more evolved biologically. We're all the exact same type of species, and there's absolutely no way that evolution should be used as a justification for harming another human being. Even if we go back 2,000 years from now, we are still the same piece of shit that attacked and killed people over shiny rocks. With all that being said, on the flip side, since the majority of humanity has come to this agreement that certain things are socially and philosophically moral, there has to be some biological reason to us creating these norms. And that's what I'm trying to highlight, because the nature of being a person is so complicated that I want to make sure you as my listeners can recognize and put aside any arguments for morality that stem from society and our nurturing environment. Because people get harmed every day, and for the most of them, they are immoral because they choose to be moral. We as a society have shown that there are humans who can choose to not behave badly, even in the worst circumstances. So I'm going to leave a bad upbringing, a traumatic childhood, poverty, classism, and any other human experience out of my attempt to explain human morality, and just focus on the biological reasons for it, or maybe a lack thereof. Let's find out. Now, the points I was highlighting in the last section are called the empirical senses of morality and the normative senses of morality. Normative being the one I want you to put aside for now. Now, the Plato Encyclopedia states that there are a number of different levels to morality and ethics in science within the empirical senses. The 6 arguments include 1. Normative judgment and guidance. This refers to our ability to make judgments about what is right or wrong, and how we guide our behavior based on those judgments. 2. Sentiments and detection. We have the capacity to feel certain emotions, known as sentiments, and recognize them in others. For example, empathy allows us to understand how someone else might feel. This is more specifically focusing on the fact that we know other humans experience emotions because we do ourselves as individuals, not acting based on emotions. 3. Motivation by sentiments. Sometimes our feelings drive our actions. For instance, if we feel compassion, we might help someone in need. 4. Moral judgment and intuition. We tend to make specific moral judgments or have intuitive feelings about what's morally acceptable. This is often referred to as our quote-unquote moral sense. Behavioral tendencies. Our moral judgments influence our behavior. So if we believe lying is wrong, we're less likely to lie. And 6. Societal norms. Societies develop certain rules and norms based on these moral intuitions and behavior. Now, arguments 3 to 6 are much more complex and start delving into the points I'd ask you to ignore. But it is important to mention them as they can be divided into generic capacities of moral judgment for points 1 to 2, and specific tendencies of humans for moral judgments for points 3 to 6. And I'm focusing on points 1 to 2 because it's not the morality of humans that I'm trying to discuss, but rather the evolutionary mechanisms of moral judgment, which is not just based on emotions, but also involves how we exercise these judgments based on different scenarios within society. To simplify it even more, I'll give you an example. Lying would be considered a moral error for a lot of people, but certain scenarios within society might force you to lie for the benefit of someone else, in what we usually call a white lie. When we become doctors, and let's say a partner of one of your patients walks in and asks about something related to your patient, and you respond with, I don't know, which in fact you definitely do know, or you're trying to protect your patient's confidentiality. You're doing a legally correct thing to do, but you're also lying. You aren't being immoral in this scenario. You're being moral and exercising your moral judgment for the benefit of your patient. Now this helps us move towards the next and final section of this episode, where I'll be talking about biological altruism. We have both biological and psychological altruism, but they are different to one another. Psychological altruism involves the fact that we behave altruistically based on our emotions and intentions, whereas biological altruism has nothing to do with emotions or intentions. It's something that we just do for the pure fact of benefiting our quote-unquote reproductive fitness. Yes, you heard that right. Simping might actually be a courtship behavior that humans present. All jokes aside, biological altruism is in fact an evolutionary behavior that a lot of species share. From social insect colonies like ants and honeybees, to some monkeys and even vampire bats showing altruistic behaviors. And before we go further, essentially replace altruism with moral judgment here because that's what evolutionary biologists like to call it. So we're moving on from the philosophy to the actual biology of ethics and morals. Now I mentioned vampire bats, and they're a great example of how biological altruism works. These bats will essentially throw up whatever blood they had sucked in order to feed their other members with blood who weren't so lucky as vampires that night. This is helping them to ensure the survival of the members of their population to not starve, essentially meaning that they can survive and pass on their genes to their offspring. Now for those of you who are sharp, you can quickly realize that if one member helps another member survive, to the detriment of themselves, how on earth would that benefit their chance of reproduction? This actually made Darwin question biological altruism as well. Which brings us to our first theory about evolution of this so-called altruistic gene, the group theory. This theory was first mentioned by Charles Darwin himself in his published work in 1871 known as The Descent of Man. To quote him, a tribe including many members who were always ready to give aid to each other and sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection, end quote. His theory suggested that we shouldn't be looking at the selection pressure of the altruistic phenotype on an individual basis, but rather at the group or tribe size. Alright, there we go, that's the theory of evolution of altruism, right? No, that's not it. J. Maynard Smith in 1964 and J.C. Williams in 1966 absolutely shat on this theory and said that the selection pressure is way too weak and that based on Dawkins in 1976, we essentially need one selfish gene member in the entire altruistic group to screw up the evolution of altruism. His name for this was the subversion from within. This was in fact supported by mathematical models provided by Sober and Wilson in 1998, with a bunch of other people all the way up to 2011 by Sober again. This brings us to a more modern and much more widely accepted theory known as the kin selection theory. In this theory, both the altruistic and selfish phenotypes exist, and the selfish member can screw with the altruistic one. But there's also the fact that the altruistic can just not give food to anyone outside of their family. And since we're much more closely related to our family than any other member of the same species, just from a different group, that entire family is much more likely to carry the altruistic gene. This means that when one altruistic member helps another one of its own kin, they are propagating the altruistic gene regardless. This was all explicitly proposed and supported by William Hamilton in 1964. He even created a rule called Hamilton's rule and provided an equation for this. The simple version of it is B is greater than C over R, where C is the cost of the altruist that they have to take, B is the benefit received by the other members of the altruist group, and R is the coefficient of relationship between the altruist and the member receiving this act. I'm a med student and I hate maths, so if you want to learn more about it, just use Google or something. I'm staying far, far away from maths, especially on this podcast. And if we take a look at humanity's history, it's freakishly weird with regards to how much our ancestors slept with their siblings or cousins. So if there was an altruistic family and they loved inbreeding, they definitely had a much higher chance of surviving as a whole and favoring the altruistic gene while slowly pushing out the selfish gene. In much more simpler terms, stop looking at it from the individual or group point of view and start looking at it from the gene's level, the gene's eye view. If the altruistic gene wants to survive, it is in its favor to help whichever member of its family to reproduce than the individual carrying the altruistic gene alone. The kin selection theory was also supported by dozens of mathematical models over decades, proving it is in fact correct and possible. The last part of this theory is to point out the fact that there very well may be individuals from the selfish gene. Again, I have to go back to the point that harming a person in any shape or form cannot be justified using genetics, because we're humans and we are much more complex than a simple gene. But if we go back to altruistic versus selfish genes, they both can have an offspring together. But the very fact that this is related to reproductive fitness and courtship behavior, altruistic individuals are much more likely to mate with one another than the selfish individuals. So over time, evolution will favor the altruistic gene, as selfish mates and their offsprings will be so fucked to the point that they probably can't survive. It's essentially a Punnett square, but this is a podcast and I can't show you the table. I mean, I can describe it with maths, but I think I made myself very clear about my stance on maths, especially statistics. So if you want to learn more, just look up the prisoner's dilemma game theory and replace them with altruistic and selfish mates. And that's it for the very first episode of season 2 of Not a Doctor podcast with your host, Mani. That's me. If you like this episode, make sure to give the first season a listen and stay tuned for the next episodes. Similar to last season, you can find the bibliography in the notes of this episode and ways to contact me. Alternatively, you can reach me through Twitter or X or whatever at moneybaggy, or you can email me using the address notadoctor@rahalopenmedia.org. Not a Doctor podcast is a part of Rahal Open Media, an open access project. Thank you for listening.